Welcome back to The Heat. We are talking about the G20 summit that took place in Hangzhou over the weekend. Welcome back to all our guests. I want to go back to Shanghai and Charles Tang, Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce. You, of course, took part on the B20 side of the summit as well. And a lot of excitement around that, considering one of the major groups was chaired by Jack Ma, head of Alibaba, which, of course, is based in Hangzhou. Lots of ideas there. What stuck out to you?
Well, I think that with regard to Brazil-China relationship and China's approach to the whole world, China is driving a lot of economic growth in the developing countries just by massive investment in trade with these countries. And in Brazil, during the high-level business seminar in Shanghai, where President Temer and 4 of his ministers, Minister José Serra, who was a fellow Cornellian from Cornell University, Enrique Meirelles, the Minister of Finance, which has proposed a very wise way to tackle Brazil's economic problems by cutting the cost of government. And the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Transport, who's a young minister in charge of 70% of all the Brazilian assets that will be privatized. I think that the potential for much increased partnership between Brazil and China and Latin America and China is very great.
Volker, can I bring you in from Berlin? Because innovation was one of the key hallmarks of the summit. It was on the agenda from begin with at the top. And as this closed, using innovation to reignite the engine of growth, that's something Germany can obviously get its arms around?
Yes, indeed. Actually, that was introduced into the discussions by the German government, as far as I have heard, which is to say digitalization, what we call Industry 4.0, is something that's being pushed forward by the German government domestically and inside the European Union. And that is why it has tried to make it a topic of the G20 as well. Now, that has, of course, fitted perfectly into the innovation drive that the Chinese government itself is pursuing. So we hope that this will continue through the German presidency and into the next presidency after that.
Yeah, and Daniel Price, let's pick up on this innovation idea, because, of course, it's very central to Chinese economic planning. The Germans obviously pushing it very hard as well, as we just heard. China's innovation, of course, Jack Ma was there, the head of the B20, bringing everyone together. What sort of signal did that send?
I think a very positive one. One of the outgrowths of the B20, and indeed a proposal of Jack Ma, was for an electronic world trade platform, or so-called EWTP. The idea here is that business and government working together can lower the barriers to e-commerce to make it possible for small businesses, for individuals to become involved in global supply chains, and so spread the benefits of globalization by reducing customs barriers, reducing tax barriers, providing a forum for sharing best practices and compliance with standards. And given that we're seeing in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere a kind of backlash against globalization, this might help contribute to revalidating the principal premise of the benefits of globalization.
It's fascinating. Liu Yufa in Beijing, innovation very much in China's economic plan. This idea of entrepreneurship, of small and medium-sized businesses using the technologies of today and tomorrow, very much China's view of how things should go as well, correct?
With regard to the renovation of economic growth, because traditionally the modalities adopted by the developed and the developing countries are no longer working that effectively. We all know 8 years after the financial crisis, the global economy is growing lukewarm, to say the best. So here, the renovation of economic growth should start from the readjustment of the economic structure and try to identify new areas to allow technologies to take place. And I think according to the Chinese government, the supply side reform and also the demand side reform would also help to promote the healthy economic growth.
Yeah, Hangzhou very much a centre for that off the back of Alibaba and other successes too. What about, just staying with you, so what about financial regulatory reform and domestic reforms? We're thinking of the state-owned enterprises too in China. This G20 help pushing that agenda forward too?
Oh, definitely. As the leaders at the summit in Hangzhou have agreed to promote the transparent, more open financial and physical policies, China as a major economy has to abide by the international game rules and to observe the international practices. So in this regard, this summit also provide new incentives for the Chinese government to clear the domestic economic house, and so that the national economy would be sitting on a new and sound foundation to move forward. I think in this sense, the summit has provided a good start for the Chinese government and also for the Chinese business communities to have more incentives to develop the domestic market and also to open their production website into the neighboring countries.
Interesting. Charles Tang in Shanghai, let's talk about the trade environment, because obviously global trade has been lagging. G20 trying to kickstart that with the sort of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in trouble here in the US and elsewhere. We also saw seeing the UK pulling out of the European Union, although the new Prime Minister there at the G20 pushing for as many trade deals as she could get. We're at this background where there's this sort of pause in development of international trade, yet very much a need for more of it, correct?
Well, absolutely. Innovation is playing a very important role, as Mr. Jack Ma says. You know, the e-trade and e-banking are really demolishing the barriers between the countries. In every global meeting, most of the government leaders always pay lip service to free trade, and then often they will set up their tariffs. However, with the new technologies in banking and in trading, I believe that it will help the free trade movement a lot. And the e-banking is just beginning, and worldwide e-trading has such a large potential and is helping the medium and small private enterprise in China, which is the hope and for the Chinese economy. Because the big state-owned companies did play an important role during the financial crisis and still have an important role to play, but the economy, the vibrancy of the Chinese entrepreneurs and the small, medium businessmen is what will transform and make China's economy grow.
Volker Stanzel in Berlin, of course, it's not just about economics. When you get so many world leaders together at the G20, other things are talked about too. And I'm thinking in terms of Germany's perspective, the migration crisis stemmed from the civil war in Syria, which was also on the agenda, of course, and, of course, the standoff over Ukraine. Not much solved there, or are there movements towards some sort of breakthrough?
Well, President Putin from the outset has said that he doesn't want so much emphasis on political issues, understandably, if you think of an issue like you just mentioned it, Ukraine. So in the political realm, nobody expected really progress, and I don't think we can say there was any. There was, of course, two areas where I think something may have been kickstarted. One is the area of tax evasion, and the second one is refugees. You spoke about the migrant problem. Migrant problem is a worldwide problem. The world community has failed in taking care of that by denying the UNHCR sufficient funds. Now, presently, Europe is bearing the brunt, but that might happen elsewhere as well. So to draw the attention of the world community to that problem, the way the G20 have done, might help a rethink in a lot of countries that might help to resolve that crisis. On tax evasion, obviously that's a problem for every country. Panama Papers, the recent Apple question in Ireland, and that is, with continuing globalization, bound to increase if governments don't really look hard at it, which many governments do not do. So again, the fact that the G20 have tried to emphasize this may be helpful.
Daniel Price, climate change, US and China actually ratifying the agreement. That's kind of big news, isn't it?
That is big news. With the ratification of China and the United States, it brings to a total of 40% of global emissions those countries who have ratified the Paris Climate Accord. So that's quite significant. But more than that, there were a number of other deliverables at this summit which bear directly on climate. One is the commitment of the G20 leaders to complete the WTO Environmental Goods Agreement by the end of 2016. That's an agreement that's intended to reduce tariffs on climate-friendly goods. Another commitment had to do with the reduction of hydrofluorocarbons under the Montreal Protocol. HFCs are much more than carbon, are real contributors to greenhouse gases and ozone depletion. And there was work done on aviation emissions and heavy-duty vehicles as well. So,
which have been stumbling blocks in the past. So,
yes, they have.
Yeah, it's good to see that area of cooperation between the US and China. And thanks all so much for a very stimulating discussion. That's it for this edition of The Heat.